B'Elanna's in a good mood, which probably means something terrible's going to happen. She's complimentary to the people she sees in engineering, except for Ramrod and Seven, who are here to further his study of warp gubbins. Her negative response could be because she's got a lot of work to do, or it could be due to Ramrod being a proper weirdo to her a few episodes back when he thought she fancied him. Or it could be related to the reason she stumbles and sits down. Ramrod runs a scan and finds that she's supporting another life form. That's nothing new to her, having acted as a host to a neck hugger back in Season 5, though this one's a little different. She's pregnant. She and Paris are a bit surprised by this turn of events, not because they hadn't been trying, the mental image of Paris's gurning O-face being one I could have done without, but because the odds of Klingon human sexy times resulting in a pregnancy are relatively low. Everything seems fine though, according to the doc, despite B'Elanna's earlier wobbly caused by chemical changes. Those changes can also affect behaviour apparently, perhaps explaining why the writers have given B'Elanna an episode where she isn't just the angry one. I guess we'll see if that lasts. There are things to organise and they'll need to adapt to the news, but they're generally happy about the situation. That's what they're telling each other anyway. B'Elanna says she wants to keep it all under wraps for a bit, though I suspect that's already gone down the shitter with Seven and Ramrod being involved. Sure enough, Neelix has already found out, Ramrod being the one to spill his guts. And if Neelix knows, then everybody knows. Hell, they've even remembered that Kim exists and told him too. The only person who seems unaware is Tuvok, who Paris has volunteered to work with. That's not like Paris, and naturally there's an ulterior motive. Tuvok's a father, you see, and Paris wants to make sure he's got an expert on tap if he ever needs advice. All in all, both the ship and the expecting parents have adapted well enough to the news, though the unsolicited parenting tips from random people can go do one as far as B'Elanna is concerned. A joke from Paris about not getting in the way of Klingon mothers goes down terribly, which is understandable given B'Elanna's baggage, and her anger is brushed away by the script as a mood swing. Feels like a bullshit way to handle childhood trauma, but let's see where it's going. Whatever the destination, it'll have to wait. They've been summoned by the doc unexpectedly, and that's unlikely to be good news. The news isn't good, but only initially. There's a problem with the fetus, specifically a curvature of the spine, but it can be corrected in utero with genetic science bollocks. This isn't entirely unexpected for B'Elanna, it seems. She had the same condition corrected with surgery after birth, as did her mother. The doc says it's hereditary, particularly in Klingon females, before realising he's just shat the bed and told them their baby's sex after B'Elanna asked him not to. No point crying over spilt amniotic fluid, and Paris asks if we can go one further. The doc was able to simulate the baby's spine at nearly a year old from genetic data, so Paris wants to see the whole baby. The doc can do that, albeit as a guesstimate, and baby Lana is shown in holographic form. Learning that she'll have forehead ridges surprises B'Elanna, as the child will only be 25% Klingon. It's not quite that simple, says the doc, Klingon genetic stuff being quite dominant. Paris saying she looks like her mother triggers a flashback of someone saying the same to B'Elanna, presumably her shit dad who skipped out on her when she was a kid. The mystery memory returns later when a subdued B'Elanna goes to bed, something from her childhood from the looks of things. It's a camping trip with other kids, though not one she's enjoying. The other kids, her cousins apparently, dislike her, she says. Her dad is dismissive and she's forced onto a hike with them while the adults go fishing. Back to reality, and it's morning. Well, morning for her. We're on a spaceship and everybody works shifts, so time in relation to parts of a day is irrelevant. Let's call it breakfast time instead, and ask ourselves why Paris thinks replicating a toaster, some bread, and some peanut butter is smarter than just replicating the peanut butter toast. Actually, let's not, because he doesn't matter. Let's go to sickbay with B'Elanna instead, where, after the doc tells her he's arranged a rigorous course of parenting-related classes for them, we begin the genetic science bollocks. That means dimming the lights for a while, because reasons, which means it's time for another trip down memory lane. B'Elanna's hike with her cousins has been paused for food. She says she's not hungry, possibly so she doesn't have to interact, but is convinced over by one of them. That gives the other two a chance to play a very funny trick on her, putting a worm on her sandwich because Klingons like eating worms. In the defense of the first cousin who invited B'Elanna over, she thinks her brother's acting like a cock too. Explaining that he does this stuff all the time doesn't prevent B'Elanna from running off. to reality once more, and the procedure is a success. Genetic Bobbins has corrected the spinal issue. Isn't fiddling with DNA great, eh? It's certainly given her an idea, and she pops to a holography lab to have a fiddle. A snip here, a twist there. Why, you could get rid of anything that would make people different, that would prevent them from blending in, that would make them a target. I wonder if giving her modified child blonde hair was an intentional choice by the writers. If so, did someone else draw the line at giving her blue eyes as well? B'Elanna may think this is what's best for her daughter, but convincing the doc to perform unnecessary treatment is another thing entirely, not least of which because we're in very fucking muddy waters ethically and legally. B'Elanna's trying to couch it all as simply preemptive to remove the unnecessary redundancies that Klingon biology provides. Shit like having a third lung. Neelix gets by on one after all, and that's not even his. Arguing it's the same as taking out an appendix during routine surgery isn't exactly convincing, and the doc remains skeptical. He's willing to check her data, but the fact she hasn't even discussed it with Paris yet certainly isn't helping. That goes equally poorly for her, though at least she's willing to be honest with him about her reasons. He guesses it's because of her own childhood, and she admits as such. Voyager may not be a colony like the one she grew up on, but it's still mostly humans. She doesn't want her daughter to experience the same bigotry that she has and thinks this is a solution. Paris won't agree, and we all end up in front of Janeway. She's frankly perplexed at this being something she's expected to adjudicate. B'Elanna wants her to order the doc to do a genetic science to her unborn fetus, and I'm pretty sure there's nothing in the Starfleet rulebook providing guidance for such a situation. It doesn't help that this might be illegal. Genetic manipulation for the purpose of augmenting abilities is outlawed, but correcting medical conditions isn't. This wouldn't be fixing a problem, but nor is it providing augmentation. The whole thing is a grey area, but it smells a lot like designer babies, and that's all kinds of fucked up. Janeway sends them away with the knowledge that she won't overrule the doc, but that this whole thing has less to do with others than themselves. They don't need a superior officer, they need a marriage counsellor. Paris arrives at the door of his best friend / thinly veiled homoerotic love interest, looking for a place to sleep. In a curious turn of events, Kim is on the side of B'Elanna, not for the genetic alterations, but because of the emotional reasoning behind them, and he thinks Paris should make a greater effort to try and understand how serious this is for her. It's a rare show of, well, anything from Kim. Add it to the joking we saw earlier, and it's almost like he has a personality. A shame it'll be forgotten by the next episode. While Kim is having his brief character spurt, B'Elanna's back in her memories. When she returns to the campsite after running off during the hike, it's night and the adults are starting to get worried. The reason for her leaving comes out, not from B'Elanna, but from the brother and sister of the dickhead who did it. He apologizes and B'Elanna brushes it aside, but it's proven to her that she was right to try and avoid engaging with them. It's not helped by her dad trying to say this is simply how kids act and she just needs to get over it. What a shithead. As if to prove as much, he leaves her alone and goes back to the campfire with everybody else. Prick. Later on, as the other kids are asleep, except B'Elanna who's listening, her shithead dad again repeats that it was probably B'Elanna's fault for overreacting, before admitting that he's not been around much and has made a mistake by getting romantically involved with a Klingon, because being around them is too much like hard work. On the shit parent scale, he's giving Seven's mum and dad a run for their money, and they literally got their kid assimilated. B'Elanna and Paris bump into each other the next day in the corridor, and Chakotay has enough sense to make himself scarce. Or, just possibly, he might have organised it. The two manage to actually talk rather than argue, and agree to go back to their shared quarters for breakfast in private. At least they would have done if the doc hadn't called them both to sickbay. He's looked over the data B'Elanna gave him and performed his own tests too. The result is that he's now completely changed his mind. In fact, he thinks it's necessary as he's had a chance to really look at things, and it might be dangerous for the fetus if the pregnancy continues as is. It's so important that he scheduled the procedure for tomorrow. That's quite the about-face under the circumstances, and I'm sure there's nothing dodgy at all about someone who has access to the doc's systems suddenly getting the result she wanted overnight. Looks like Paris thinks this is a bit dodgy too, perhaps alerted by his innate scumbag senses. Luckily, he has someone he can ask. Ramrod started taking an interest in genetics after his mum and dad altered him to become a biological weapon against the Borg, a sentence that would give him worst parent bragging rights on literally any other ship in the fleet. On Voyager, though, he's got a lot of competition for that title. Ramrod finds an error in the Doc's calculations that have made him draw the wrong conclusion, except it's not an error. Errors are accidental, whereas Seven says the Doc's program has been altered. And wouldn't you know it, B'Elanna's already in sickbay, despite the Doc saying treatment wouldn't begin until tomorrow. The sickbay's not responding to calls either, and the Doc's program is locked, so he can't be disabled. We pop down there with Tuvok and some extras for company. The door's locked, but we all know how little Starfleet cares about security by now, so Tuvok just pulls it open with a suction cup. A force field around the bed takes a little more effort to turn off, but that gives us a chance to explain to the Doc how he's been fiddled with. He's willing to listen to that at least, and disables himself until he's been checked over. Paris asks Tuvok to give he and B'Elanna a moment alone, and Tuvok complies despite there having just been multiple security breaches caused by one of the people he's leaving. 10 out of 10 for compassion, but I'm not convinced it was the right call for the guy in charge of security. Oh, and the door closes when the guards leave, so I guess that's fixed now too. Anywho, it gives them a chance to talk, and eventually for B'Elanna to share precisely why she wanted to do a genetics, which we explore through the power of half flashback. B'Elanna's pissed at her shithead dad, which is fair enough considering he's a complete cock. She tells him she heard what he said, and he has the fucking audacity to say she shouldn't have listened in. It ends with her saying he should leave if he can't stand being around her and her mother, which is what he did a couple of weeks later. B'Elanna's blamed herself for that sentence ever since, despite it clearly being her awful dickbag of a father who was at fault. And, naturally, she expects the same of Paris. After all, they're constantly arguing, just like the parents she grew up with, and that'll be more difficult with a kid, too. Paris is taken aback by the idea. For all his many, oh so many faults, he's not as much of a cock as B'Elanna's father. Besides, nobody else is going to put up with his shit, so this is as close to destiny as he's ever likely to see. This is enough to reassure B'Elanna, and they have a bit of a cuddle. We'll assume the guards allowed her to get dressed again before dragging her to the brig. Just kidding, of course. We're on the good ship Voyager, which means there's no such thing as consequences. B'Elanna visits sickbay to apologise for basically brainwashing the Doc, and he's polite enough to not make a fuss. Baby Lana starts kicking, and B'Elanna shares the moment with the Doc, who she also asks to be Baby Lana's godfather. They bring up the simulation of what Baby Lana will look like, and we leave them to stare at some PlayStation 2 cutscene quality CGI as we fly away. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra, just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man, it deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. When I first proposed the shit parent support group for Voyager's most broken members, this is what I suggested be their motto. Whilst Larkin himself may have been a cunt, he was bang on with this poem. It acknowledges the intergenerational effects of poor parenting, the fear that you, too, may bring life into this world, only to curse them with the same conflicted emotions that you carry for your own parents. It took B'Elanna a near-death experience to start processing hers, and Paris turned himself into a fucking lizard because of the baggage he was given in his own childhood. Tangentially, that might be part of his opposition to B'Elanna's proposed genetic bobbins, now I think about it. Altering your child to fit a particular niche is along the same lines as having certain expectations for them, something that would be uncomfortably close to home for him. Yet another unexpected consequence. It's shit parents all the way down. All of which is to say it's understandable why B'Elanna would want to create the easiest life possible for her child, even while we acknowledge that her reasoning is completely fucked up. The internalized racism that contributes to this, and the flashback we saw, also offers a wider topic of interest for us to explore. Dean, the arsehole nephew, gives us the line, "My teacher said Klingons like live food." While not inaccurate, the fact that he's used this as a prank suggests his education has ignored, or inadequately explained, the cultural differences. It'd be easy to dismiss this as kids being kids, but I think that would ignore the potential implications of something more serious, that the Federation may not value diversity quite as much as we'd like. For such thinking to be so normalized that a member of her own family casually engages in targeted harassment for fun, despite nearly a century having passed since the end of hostilities between the Klingon Empire and the Federation, certainly indicates that humans haven't so much outgrown their bigotry as redirected it. To those who consider my conclusion an overreaction, how is this any different from throwing a banana at someone with Afro-Caribbean heritage? We'll end on numbers, shall we? Paris says that Voyager has Bajorans and Vulcans and a Talaxian. We know there are a couple of Bolians, one being our old friend Chatty Blue Lad, and everybody's favourite murder boy Lon Sudo was a Betazoid. There's one more Betazoid on board, or at least there was during Counterpoint in Season 5. That sounds pretty diverse, until B'Elanna says that 140 of the people on Voyager are human. From a Federation containing hundreds of different species, the overwhelming majority in Starfleet are us. Now, I'll grant you that's most likely due to the limitations of filming. Putting half your extras through makeup isn't cheap, but ignoring the practical reasons, it certainly paints a picture, doesn't it? And one that isn't necessarily as favourable to we humans as it could be. Either we're spreading like a particularly potent strain of fungus, so there are more of us to recruit, or other member species are finding reasons not to send people into Starfleet. I'm not sure I much like either of those, though they're both entirely plausible. Come to think of it, that might be exactly why I don't like them. End of episode.
Do 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 do. We're not murderers. We're not being chased by shapeshifters. We're just normal dogs.
Space dog?
Yes, mate. What can I do for you?
You don't actually know what Loki means, do you? Woof.